Good morning, friends. It's Saturday, and I'm back with Chapter 25 of my upcoming book, Campaign at Fort Stix. Now it's time to grab a snack, dim the lights, and let me take you into the mists of time with a story I call Elevation and Windage. All in all, it was an awesome birthday. After the party, Dad and I installed the scope to my new rifle, and then I cleaned and oiled it for the first time. When I was done, and it was ready for shooting, the sun was already down, and I would have to wait until Dad got home from work the next day. I was actually okay with that, as I was tired. I guess the tension of working to make the money by my birthday, and the work I did, took its toll on me, because I laid on my couch to read, and the sun came up. I decided to have a piece of my birthday cake for breakfast. I knew Mom would not approve, but since she was still asleep, I could not ask her. I ate the cake while sitting at the desk looking up at my new rifle. When I finished, I went outside to feed and water the birds and water my garden. I noticed the white chickens and ducks were already what I would call full grown. I thought back to when we got them and realized they were about 8 weeks old. The Rhode Island Reds and Barred Rock chickens were not as big as the others and seemed to be about half grown, while the turkeys were about the same size as the white Cornish chickens. I made a mental note to ask Dad about them when he got home. Once I finished my chores, I decided it was time to find the right spot to build my new fort. Walking the tree line out in the field, I looked for a set of trees that would make a good base for the fort. Instead of just looking for 2 large trees, I was now looking for 4 medium trees. While we were at the store in the sporting goods department getting my rifle, I had to wait while my dad did the paperwork. I amused myself by exploring and came across an advertisement for elevated deer blinds. These blinds stood on 4 legs like a windmill. It seemed to me I could use 4 trees instead of pipe legs and build a wood platform. I found 4 suitable trees in the back corner of the field. Actually, there were 6 trees there, spaced correctly and of the proper thickness. It was like 2 rows of 3 someone had planted intentionally. About 6 feet off the ground, there were several branches that would have to be trimmed, but that was okay. I headed for the garage and my materials pile. Returning to the trees with 2 10-foot 2x4s, I planned to nail them to the trees on either side to support the floor. It was then that I realized I could not reach high enough to put them where I wanted them, which was about 6 foot off the ground. I returned to the garage to build a ladder. I would need one to get in the fort anyway, so might as well use it to build it too. Much the same as I did for the vault, I built a ladder. But this one was 8 foot high, as I figured there was no need to cut the 2x4s. I would build as high as I could reach. Before I left the garage, I grabbed a small level and stuck it in my back pocket. I wanted to make sure my floor was level. Back at the tree, I stood the ladder against a tree and climbed it. Holding onto the tree, I looked around to see what the view would be like at this height. It was good. I could clearly see across the field diagonally behind Aunt Florence's house, all the way to the road, and in front of our house from where the driveway met the road all the way to the house and into the backyard. It was an excellent position and elevation. I climbed down and grabbed a 10-foot 2x4. Then it occurred to me that I would not be able to hold it up from one end while also nailing it. Looking at the trees, I found the answer. I propped one end of the 2x4 on a branch and lifted the other end as I climbed the ladder. Then, putting the level on the board, I centered the bubble and nailed it to the tree. Moving the ladder to the other end, I was able to break the branch with the hammer and nail the board to the tree once it was level. The first board was easy, and once it was secure, I moved the ladder to the other side to put up the second. That is when I realized I had no way to match the height of the first board. I sat on the ground and thought about it for a bit before going to the garage for a couple more 2x4s. I propped the two new 2x4s onto the nailed one and climbed the ladder carrying up the other end. After starting a nail, I put a level on the board and centered the bubble. Then I nailed the board to the tree but left the head of the nail sticking out since this was to be a temporary. After doing this at each end, it was no trouble to hold the next sideboard up to the temporary and nail it in place. Now the two sides of the floor were level, and I removed the temporary boards. Standing on the ground looking up, I was pleased to see the outline of my fort now. The 10-foot boards were even with the trees away from the field and stuck out about 2 feet past the trees on the field side. I would have a small front porch. This made my fort roughly 4 feet by 10 feet. I set off to get the floor planks next. I stood the floor planks along one of the sideboards from one end to the other and then climbed the ladder to set them in place. I planned to lay the first couple planks across and then sit on them to nail them and pull the rest up. Getting the ladder in position, I pulled up the first 2 planks and laid them across. This was going well, and I figured I would have the floor done by lunchtime easily. I nailed the first 2 planks to the 2x4 while standing on the ladder. Then I climbed up and started across to nail the other side. A very loud cracking sound erupted in the stillness, and I felt myself falling. I lunged for the nearest tree and stood on the 2x4 as I watched one of the floor planks fall to the ground in 2 pieces. Going down the ladder, I ran to the garage and grabbed Dad's tape measure. It was 4 feet across the sideboards, obviously too wide for the planks to support me. I sat next to the tree to think about the problem. I needed to support the floor, but was not sure how. Then I remembered seeing an article in one of my magazines about building tree forts. I ran inside to look it up. It took a while to figure out which magazine it was, but I found the article and read it. Looking at the drawings, I saw there needed to be 2x4s across about every 2 feet to support the floor planking. I could do that. I memorized the plans and ran out to the fort again, stopping to grab some 2x4s on the way. I laid 2 boards across the sideboards like I had the floor planks and nailed them in place 2 foot apart. Then I laid some floor planks across them and carefully stood on it. Moving my weight between the cross supports, I heard the floor plank start to crack and stepped back onto the supports. 2 foot was still too much. I climbed down and looked up at my work. Suddenly, I realized I had seen this before. It took a moment, but then I remembered this is what the floor looked like in the basement when I looked up at it. I grabbed the tape measure and ran to the basement. Measuring the boards there, the supports were 16 inches apart. They were also 2x8s, but I was not going to be putting large furniture in the fort. I ran back out to the fort. I moved one of the cross supports to 16 inches apart and put a third one at the same distance. This time, when I laid the floor planks on and stood on them, they were solid and did not even creak. Looking at the floor now with the temporary planks, I realized I could actually make the fort wider if I ran the supports out past the trees. According to the article I read, this could be done with what is called a cantilever. I decided to make them an extra foot on either side so the trees would be inside the walls. It took the rest of the afternoon to cut the supports and finish building the floor. Sitting on the new fort floor, I looked out over the field and knew this was the beginning of something good. Dad pulled into the drive while I was sitting there, and I climbed down to see if we were going to be shooting this evening before dinner. By the time I got to the house, Dad was already cracking open his first beer of the evening. He was standing in the kitchen looking out the window at the backyard. "Hey, Dad, what are you doing?" I asked. "Just relaxing," he said, and drank from the beer. "Are you ready to go shooting?" I was hopeful. He looked at me and then outside. He seemed to be trying to decide something. "Yeah, go get your rifle and some shells," he said. I grabbed the rifle and we walked out to the range. Setting the box of shells on the table, I removed the magazine from the rifle and loaded it. Dad sat at the table and I handed him the rifle, watching as he worked the bolt to load the first round and took aim. He fired 3 shots in rapid succession, left the bolt open as he laid the rifle on the table, and we walked to the target. The 3 rounds were very close to each other in the upper right corner. We went back to the table, and I watched as he adjusted the scope and fired 3 more rounds. This time, they were together within the bullseye. He fired 1 more round, hitting between the last 3 holes, and handed the rifle to me. "There you go," he said, stepping back to drink his beer. "Go ahead and put a few rounds downrange." I reloaded the magazine and chambered the first round. Carefully squeezing the trigger, I fired and was pleased to see the bullet hit at the edge of the bullseye. "Relax and squeeze the trigger as you breathe out," Dad said, and watched as I fired again. I worked the bolt and steadied myself. Squeezing slowly, the gun went off and I was pleased to see a hole in the center of the bullseye. I worked the bolt and fired again and again until the magazine was empty. We walked over to the target and I was pleased to see all but the first shot were right in the center of the bullseye. I was about to walk back and load the magazine again when Dad spoke up. "How about you run and get me another beer, and also grab Uncle Rudy's pistol and the box of shells off the front seat of my truck?" I ran to the house and grabbed the pistol. As I was taught, I pushed the release to open the cylinder to make sure there were no rounds in the weapon. Satisfied, I grabbed him a cold beer and then went out to the truck to get the box of shells. The bullets for the pistol were a lot heavier than those for my rifle. Once back at the table, Dad cracked open the fresh beer, took a drink, and then grabbed the pistol. It was an older Smith & Wesson .44 with about a 6-inch barrel. It looked like the one I saw Dirty Harry had in the movies. "So is that the same gun Dirty Harry used in the movie?" I asked. "Almost," he said, smiling as he rocked the cylinder closed. "This is a .44 Special. Same caliber, but not the Magnum like in the movie." I watched as he emptied the gun at the target. The pistol sounded like a cannon going off compared to my rifle. When he was finished, he rolled the cylinder out and ejected the spent shells. Loading it again, he handed it to me. "Here you go," he said. "Make sure and hold it with both hands like I showed you. This is going to kick a lot harder than your baby Dragoon." I stood in front of the table and held the gun in 2 hands. Taking careful aim, I squeezed the trigger and fired. Unlike the rifle, it was easy to see when the pistol hit the target as it left a big hole. I hit it just above the bullseye and was pleased. When the pistol fired, it did kick a lot harder than my muzzle-loading pistol, and the gun flew back nearly to my face. I stiffened my arms more for the next shot and fired. After finishing off that cylinder, Dad loaded it once more and shot it again. We took the target off the board and carried it into the house. As we walked past the chicken coop, I remembered how big the birds were. "Hey Dad, how come the white chickens are so much bigger than the others?" I asked. "They're as big as the turkeys." We stopped in front of the chicken coop and he looked around at the birds. He seemed to be considering something. "Those are jumbo Cornish. They are meat birds and bred to grow fast," Dad said. "They're about 8 weeks old now and it's time to butcher." I looked at the chicken coop. There were about a dozen of the white chickens and 6 of each of the others. "All 12? I asked. "Yes, they will start to die off in the next couple of weeks if we don't butcher them first." Walking in the house, Mom was in the kitchen cooking dinner. She watched us put the guns away as she made herself a cup of coffee. I headed for my room at the front porch to wait to be called for dinner. I could hear Mom and Dad discussing the need to get a freezer so they could store the chickens once we butchered them. As I passed the room I shared with Mark, it suddenly occurred to me that I had not seen him all day. I looked in, expecting to see him there, but the room was empty. Then I remembered he went home with my aunt to spend the week with her since our cousins were closer to his age. At dinner, Dad said we would be butchering chickens on Saturday, and on Sunday, we would be making another pen for the ducks since they were getting too big. He said we should make a separate pen for the turkeys as well, but since there would be 24 less birds in the coop, they should be okay until mid-October when it was time to butcher them. I spent the following day working on my new fort. I used a milk crate as a step to install 2 more 10-foot 2x4s about a foot higher than my head to support the roof. Since there would be no one walking up there, I installed the roof planks across them the same way I had started to make the floor. I had originally intended to put a roof over the porch area of the fort, but could not figure out how to nail the planks on without walking on the roof. So I made a command decision to have no roof over the front porch. When Dad got home from work, he and Grandpa unloaded an upright freezer from his truck into the dining room. They stood it in the corner and plugged it in. I overheard Grandpa telling Dad he would be glad to have the freezer when winter set in, as it meant he would not have to worry about going grocery shopping as much if he stocked it well. He said to also make sure and freeze up a bunch of vegetables since we weren't canning any. I spent most of the following morning working out plans to close in the sides of my new tree fort. The ladder I built only reached to the floor, and I needed to somehow nail planks to the 2x4s which supported the roof and floor. The lower ones would not be a problem, but the upper ones were now about 13 feet off the ground, and I had no ladder that tall. Thus began a long and slow process of installing the side planks. After cutting them to length with Dad's jigsaw, I nailed each plank to the bottom 2x4 while standing on the ladder. Then I would climb onto the floor and reach around to nail the top. The first one was quite precarious as I leaned outside the fort to hold the nail with one hand and drive it with the other. Then I got the idea to start the top nails while the board was on the ground, so I could hold on with one hand while I nailed with the other to secure the top. When I did the back wall, I was glad I had thought to do this, because reaching around the tree in the corner to nail the last plank was quite trying. I was about halfway finished with the second long wall when I saw Dad's truck pull into the drive. Dad had a load of lumber in the truck and a small wading pool. I wondered what the wading pool was for. When I came out of the field to help him unload, he explained the pool would be set into the ground to create a place for the ducks to swim in their pen. After we got it all unloaded beside the driveway near the chicken coop, he turned the pool upside down and traced a line on the ground around it with a spray can of paint. Observing the line on the ground, I was instructed to dig it out the next day so the top of the pool was level with the ground when placed in the hole. Then Dad said I needed to dig a hole in the field, away from the shooting range near the tree line, about 2 foot deep and big enough to fit a 5-gallon bucket in. This would be used to bury the feathers and other scraps after we butchered. I was still contemplating this additional workload to my already busy schedule when Mom called us in for dinner. It had taken most of the day to install planks to the back and 1.5 sides of the tree fort. There was still a half of a side and the front wall with a porch door to build. Well, there really was no hurry to finish the fort. I went on inside for dinner and then was asleep on my couch before I even finished reading a story in my magazine. I finished my chores quickly in the morning and set to digging the pool out for the ducks. I was surprised it did not take very long. The area Dad chose was right next to the field, about 10 feet away from the chicken coop. The ground there was relatively soft. Once the pool was set in place, I moved out to the tree line to dig the next hole. The ground there had lots of sand and it was real easy to dig. After I put the shovel away, I walked out toward the fort and stood looking at it for a while before getting started. I was pleased with the work already completed and had a picture in my mind of what the finished fort would look like. I climbed the ladder and returned to planking the side where I stopped the night before. Standing on the front porch looking in, I could not help but feel I had built a very large wooden box. It was very dark at the rear now that the walls were closed in. I would need to add windows to this fort just like I did the first fort. Since the floor planks extended out to the porch, it was necessary to add a piece of 2x4 on top of the planks to nail the bottom of the planks to. This left an opening for the door to one side of the porch. Using several planks, I nailed them together with cross planks at the top and bottom and stood the door in place. Finally, I nailed hinges to the door and nailed them to the last wall plank to complete the front wall. Inside, with the door closed, it was almost pitch black. There were several thin beams of light coming in the sides where the edges of siding planks were uneven, but they barely illuminated the interior. My next step would have to be windows, so I headed off to cut some shorter planks to use at the top of the bottoms of the openings to keep the planks in place. I decided to put one window on each side in order to make sure I could see what was happening all around the fort. These were to be about 18 inches wide and 12 inches high, except at the front porch where it would be 2 foot square. Just like the original fort, the windows would have shutters that lifted up to open. Once the cross pieces were nailed in place, I began cutting the openings with a small handsaw, starting with the porch window. Just as the last piece of wood fell from the front porch opening, I saw Dad drive up and left the fort for the evening. He was just getting out of the truck when I came out of the field. I walked with him as he looked over the pool I dug into the ground and followed him inside for dinner. It had been a pretty busy day. Sitting at the dining room table with my parents, I looked out the window toward the field. I could barely make out the new fort tucked back in the trees. I had been working hard to build it this week, and so far it was turning out just like I had imagined. My thoughts were interrupted when Dad spoke up. "Kevin, in the morning I need you to be ready to go with me," he said, drinking from his beer. "We're going to South Bend to the auto auction to see about buying a car or two to rebuild. So make sure and feed and water the chickens and do not run off." "Okay, Dad," I said, nodding. I was excited. It had been a while since I got to go anywhere, and I knew South Bend was over an hour away. The last time I was there was when we passed through on our way to Ohio to look at airplanes. And of course, any day away from the house with Dad meant that I would get to have lunch out somewhere. There was one place that made my favorite little hamburgers, and it was along the way. I was going to ask Dad to get lunch at White Castle. I hope you enjoyed this look into the campaign at Fort Stix. That's all for now, but I'll be back again next week with another story, just for you. Until then, sleep well.